Okay, great, thank you.
All right. Let's see. Tom, we good? All right. Hi, everyone. All right. Hi. Welcome to Politics and Prose. Thank you all for being here. As you can see, we have reinstated our mask policy due to the rising COVID cases in DC. So we thank you for cooperating. Um, we have as you see, we have an event today, but our calendar is full of in-person and virtual events at politics-prose.com, where we also offer trips and classes. Uh, so we will also not be having a Q. We will be having a Q&A. We will not have a book signing after this evening's program. Our authors are very busy, so we were lucky to get them here at 6, but we have to let them leave at 7. And we're glad that you all were okay with that change in our schedule. We will be having a Q&A, so because we are filming, we're streaming to our YouTube channel. We would love for you to come to our audience mic when it is time for the Q&A during the event. Right there to my left, your right. And we ask that you speak in the mic so not only we can hear you, but our camera can hear you. All right. And once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chair and just help us reset the bookstore. It helps us reset the bookstore as quickly as possible. All right. So this evening, I am excited to introduce Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorunnipa for the release of their book. His Name is George Floyd, One Man's Life in the Struggle for Racial Justice. Robert Samuels is a national political enterprise reporter from the Washington Post who focuses on the intersection of politics, policy, and people. He previously wrote stories about life in the district for the Post's social issues team. Samuels joined the Post in 2011 after spending nearly 5 years working for the Miami Herald. Toluse Olorunnipa is a political enterprise and investigations reporter for the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 2019 and previously covered in the White House. Before that, he spent 5 years at the Bloomberg, where he reported on politics and policy from Washington and Florida. Both authors will be in conversation with Eugene Robinson, who writes twice a week column on politics and culture and hosts a weekly online chat with readers. In a 3 decades long career at the Washington Post, Robinson has been a city hall reporter, city editor, foreign correspondent in Buenos Aires and London, a foreign editor, and an assistant managing editor in charge of the paper's style section. He started writing a column for the op-ed page in 2005. In 2009, he received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his eloquent columns on the 2008 presidential campaign that focused on the election of the first African-American president, showcasing graceful writing and grasp of the larger historic picture. Robinson is the author of Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America, The Last Dance in Havana, and Coal to Cream, A Black Man's Journey Beyond Color to an Affirmation of Race. He lives with his wife and 2 sons in Arlington. Let's give our guests a round of applause.
Thanks very much for the introduction. I don't know if the microphone is working or not. I usually need one, now this microphone is working. So first, I want to congratulate Robert and Tolu on this book. It is a really, really good book, and it's and all the more remarkable for having been done so quickly. You guys reported a fabulous series about George Floyd and built the book on that, but you went so much further than that. It's really really remarkable. So hats off to you both. I'm here to facilitate. I want to hear you guys talk, but I just throw out one question. You guys like work together. You were joined at the hip for 6 months or whatever, doing this incredible task. Do you still get along? Do you still, did it come to blows at any point, or how did you manage the relationship in getting all this done?
Tolu? Well, Robert and I, the biggest clash that we've had has actually come up over the last week as we've been doing interviews, and we keep answering at the same time as soon as we get the question. And we came up with a system where if there's a jump ball for the first question, we alternate. But I always forget whether I had gone last or whether Robert had gone last. So usually he reminds me, so I guess that is him reminding me that the last interview he went first. But to answer your question, Robert and I, we just talked about a little earlier today, we've actually known each other for about 15 years.
Wow.
And I've only been a journalist for about 15 years. So that sort of tells you about how long we have worked together. One of my first internships at the Miami Herald happened when Robert happened to be working there. And I think that was something that was incredibly important. I interned at the Miami Herald. I ended up getting my first job out of college at the Miami Herald when Robert was an established journalist there. I'm making him sound old. He was not there for that much longer than me, but he was just so talented that even though he was only a couple years out of college, he was already a rock star at the Herald, and I was already looking up to him. And he got to the Post before I did, and was sort of helpful in recruiting me to the Post for several years, trying to get people to hire me there. And that is one of the reasons why we connected so easily on this project. We both have a passion for good storytelling. I am always envious of Robert because he often does stories that I wish I had done and gets people to talk that I wish I could get to talk, and moves away from the politics that in my job covering the White House and covering politicians, often don't get to cover or don't think to cover. Robert has had a knack for getting people to show America how politics impacts America, and that's what we wanted to do with this book, and that's one of the reasons why we didn't really fight that much. We didn't have that many disagreements. Our editor, a couple of our editors are actually in the audience. Our editor at the Post, Stephen Ginsberg, and our editor at Viking, Ibrahim Ahmad. They astutely helped us to navigate any of the disagreements that we had. And one other thing I'll say is that we started this project as part of a team, and the sense of teamwork at the Washington Post was incredibly important to us. The George Floyd's America Project, which ran in 2020, was a 6-part series that was done by a team of dozens of journalists. We happen to be 2 of those journalists. But that sense of camaraderie of being able to tell Floyd's story by bringing the best of reporting from a housing reporter and a healthcare reporter and an education reporter to show how these various institutions impacted Floyd's life. That teamwork was the genesis of this project. So when Robert and I decided to turn it into a book, we had already had that foundation of working together and working collaboratively, so it was easy, and we didn't have that many disagreements, though there are a couple of them that I'll take to my grave because because we worked together and we're proud of the project. But we did work pretty seamlessly over the course of a very tight timeline to write this project.
Yeah, I don't think we had time to not get along. Like, we had a big task and a big job, and the work was important. And I think we were all both really focused on being able to do something that we're proud of and that could move people.
One of the remarkable things about the book that everybody will see once they read it is how you got people to talk to you, how you got people who hadn't really come forward before and certainly hadn't given their full stories. One of those people is Maurice Hall, George Perry Floyd's, I think of him as Perry now after reading the book, but a friend from Houston up to Minneapolis. Tell us about how you got him to talk, and also tell us about that relationship between Hall and Floyd, because they were, you know, two of the principal actors on Memorial Day 2020.
Right. So Maurice Hall, for those who haven't read the book, he is the friend who is with George Floyd at Cup Foods on the day he meets Derek Chauvin. And no one really knew why they were together, because during the trial he had pleaded the fifth. And we just needed to know. And by the time we got to him, Derek Chauvin had been convicted, which I think helped. But it also felt that he just needed to talk to the right journalist. And so I had a friend who had run into him the day Derek Chauvin was convicted. And I called her and I asked, "Do you know anything about him?" And she goes, "Call his mama." And she gave me the number for the mom. So I did. I called her. I called his mom. I explained what I wanted to do. She said, "This is not going to happen, but I'll tell him anyway." And he called me back. And I really explained the project, and that not only were we going to look at George Floyd's life, we were going to talk about a system of racism in this country that not just affected George Floyd, but also affected him. And, you know, if he believed in ending systemic racism, he should join us. And he said, okay. And I met him in the basement of a place where he was staying. He didn't want to disclose where he lived because he thought police were out to get him. And also people who knew George Floyd would be out to get him because he had fled the scene that day. He didn't prevent the loss of his friend. And I looked at him and I said, "I'm going to ask you these questions because I think it's time." And he said, "It's time." And before I could even talk about some of the seedier parts of their relationship, they did drugs together. He was willing to volunteer it. It was when he started going, it felt very therapeutic for him to just talk about it with someone who wanted to listen.
Do you know where he is now? I mean, what is?
I do. He's still in Minneapolis. He took a picture for a profile we did in the Washington Post magazine, which surprised me that he was willing to do it. But after George Floyd died, he fled Minneapolis and he went back to Texas. He was in a mental institution for a number of months. He showed me the medical report of what they said was going through his head. And then he moved back to Minneapolis because he felt like he owed it to George Floyd to get his life together and move on. And so he's working and he's clean. And so, yeah, he's in a better place.
He's clean now. That's
Yeah.
interesting. So that's a theme that that you pick up from the people you convinced to talk to you and to tell you in such detail about their relationships with Floyd and their movements, especially on that day and where he was and why. And there's a sense of a debt to him. Talk about that feeling.
Everyone we talked to about George Floyd told us that he was a special person. He was someone that they remembered. He was someone that was memorable for a number of different reasons from an early age, that he had an impact on his local community, that even though he was this huge guy, he was someone who was a mama's boy, who had his mother's heart, and who was, in the words of several people that we spoke to, a gentle giant. Now, obviously people know that he had a number of issues and a number of challenges over the course of his life, but his essence and his spirit was to be someone who was caring and empathetic and sometimes to a fault, wanting to make people feel comfortable. And I think that's part of the reason people wanted to speak about him in his death in a way that did not reflect what millions of people saw on the video, just his worst day, the worst 9 minutes of his life, him in agony. They wanted people to know that he was much more than that he was someone who obviously had ambitions. And we go back over the course of the book and we talk about the ambitions that he had from a young age. When he was in second grade, he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. And we talked to his second grade teacher about his experiences in school and the fact that even though he was from a very poor community, even though most of the students in his class had been behind on national metrics from kindergarten. He ended second grade on grade level. He was reading and writing and doing math on a national grade level, even though he's in a segregated, underfunded school. So people saw a sense of promise in him. They saw the ambitions that he had, that at some point in his life he wanted to be a football player, and he was pretty talented and had gone to the state championship, and it did look like there were these avenues for him to escape the issues that he faced as a poor black kid growing up in the projects. And it just seemed like every time he was taking a step, every time he was trying to make it out, the door would be closed on him. And especially in those final moments, those final months of his life, he had gone to Minnesota to get clean. He had gone to Minnesota to have a fresh start, to leave the state of Texas, where he felt like he couldn't have a chance because he had a criminal record, and he couldn't get health care because Texas is a place that it's harder to get health care if you're poor. So he left, and he wanted to do something different with his life. But then the pandemic hit, and before the pandemic hit, his mother died. And before his mother died, his roommate died, and died because of an overdose. And it was somebody that reminded him of himself. So he just faced so many different challenges, especially in that last movement of his life, that people wanted people to remember him for what he was striving for, to remember him for his ambitions. And that's why a number of people talked to us, because they wanted people to know that he was much more than those final moments and those final months.
And they also remembered the way he made them feel, right? One of the this is very feedbacky to speak. One of the more interesting discussions we had while we were writing the book was about his relationship with Courtney Ross, who tells this story about the first time they met, how he said he loved her. And that really meant something to Courtney. And then we spoke with Shawanda Hill, who was his other lover in Minneapolis. And she says, and I knew we were meant to be together because the first night I met him, he told me he loved me. And I said to myself, well, this doesn't look too good. And it turns out that everybody who George Floyd met has this story of him saying he loved them. And that really had an impact on them because they grew up in communities where they don't get that message very often. And in a lot of senses, because he had spoken those words to them, they felt a debt to him. They felt they owed something to him, particularly when people were very concerned about the character that he was, that was presented.
It seems to me that he also sort of demonstrated that love to people, though. I mean, they really got a feeling that it was more than just empty words, that he was a really caring person who, with his, female friends, with his male friends, with everybody.
Yeah, one of the things we wanted to do in this book was allow people to see George Floyd speaking in his own voice. So we had people that he talked to recreate the conversations that they had. And also we looked at his social media posts, and some of them he was, trying to get people to stop the violence in his community, essentially saying, I know I've done things, I know I have flaws in my own life, I know I'm not perfect, but what's happening right now is too far. Put the guns away. Let's not have that be part of our community. That's not the kind of pain that we want to be reflected in our community. And in recreating a lot of those conversations, that was who Floyd was to a lot of people. That he was somebody that a lot of people said, obviously, it's a bit cliche, but they'd say he would give you the shirt off his back if he could. And one of the things he wanted to do in leaving Houston for Minneapolis was provide for his child, his daughter. And he felt it was incredibly difficult for him as someone with a record, as someone who didn't have a college degree, as someone who had a past, to provide and to be financially stable in his hometown, because it was so punitive. And he felt that every time he applied for a job, people would talk about his record. And so he left and he went to Minneapolis. So he was somebody who would take those steps and take what could be seen as drastic, leaving your entire family behind, leaving the community that to try to have a fresh start. That was something that he did in part because he wanted to provide, he wanted to be there, he wanted to be able to sacrifice. And we write about this over the course of his life. There were so many different times where he couldn't just be a kid. He couldn't just be a college student. He was somebody who was relied on. He was someone who the community had put their hopes in. His family had put their hopes in him to make it out, to be this star athlete, to be this person that was going to go far. And you know, he tried and he strived, and he felt the need to not only look after himself, but to be somebody in the community that other people could look up to. And even the challenges and the struggles that he made, in part, were because he was trying to provide. You know, he was in a community that was ravaged by drugs, and where that was, you know, the number one, you know, thing that people did when they left high school and they couldn't find a job. And he ended up in that system as well. So, you know, we wanted to reflect that in our writing, because that's what so many people told us about. They told us, you know, that Floyd was somebody who was generous and kind-hearted in his spirit, and you know, even when he was that way to a fault, it was in part because he wanted to help. It was in part because he wanted to provide for his family. It was in part because he felt the burdens of growing up poor and feeling like he needed to make a way, and there not being that many avenues for him. And that was something that we saw in some of those conversations that were recreated, some of the scenes that people told us about, and some of the things that Floyd did when he was alive, long before he met Derek Chauvin.
You know, he was also intensely claustrophobic, and that I kind of got a sense of how terrifying his last minutes must have been for him. Where exactly did the claustrophobia come from, and was it sparked by a particular experience?
Well, in the book, the first time we hear about the claustrophobia is when he's on his way to prison, and he's in a cramped van. And over the course of his life, he starts to talk about how that experience, being a large man in a tiny cell, really enhanced the claustrophobia. One of the parts of his last interaction with the police on Earth that I think about a lot is when he looks at the officer and says, "Why don't you believe me?"
Yeah.
And thinking about that, that, you know, as journalists, we had to prove whether or not he should have been believed. And again, without much prompting, you heard people telling these stories about how he wouldn't get in the back of a car, how he would never take an elevator, how sometimes if he was in the bathroom, he'd have to have the bathroom open, because that's how intense the claustrophobia was.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's not that claustrophobic, but pretty claustrophobic, I can relate, right? I mean, I can relate to what that must have felt like to him. So you are two, we are three black men in America. How how did this book affect you? Doing this book affect you on that level? Reporting the book, writing the book. What did you feel as you went through this? Not you know, not with your journalistic detachment, but with, but what'd you feel inside?
Yeah, the journalistic detachment is hard to separate, because we've been trained over the course of so many years to put our feelings in a box and report the news, which is an important thing, that, you know, to not get consumed by a story. But this is a story that was consuming in many ways. I remember having to help write the scene of Floyd's last 9 minutes, and I had actually never watched the video, even though I was a reporter covering it. I told myself, you know, I had seen these videos too often. I know what happened. I've read, you know, different reports. I don't need to see someone losing their life on camera. So I had not watched it. Even as we did the series, I didn't watch it. I felt like I had seen enough, and I knew enough about what happened to know a man lost his life under the knee of a police officer, and I didn't need to see it. But to recreate that scene, you know, I had to watch that video dozens of times, frame by frame, what happened in the immediate moments before, what happened as he was losing his life. And that was traumatizing. That was something that was really difficult to do, because, you know, you look at George Floyd and, you know, it could be somebody you know. Yeah. It could be someone in your family. And from having to engage with the level of oppression that he faced, obviously on the day that he died, but we investigated the oppression that he faced over the course of his life, you know, and just sort of seeing, like I spoke about earlier, the doors being slightly open to him as he had a few different opportunities, as he had ambitions, and you could see the dreams that he had, and having those doors closed on his face, having every mistake that he made, and he made his fair share of mistakes, and he acknowledged those mistakes, and he regretted those mistakes, but having them amplified, having them seized upon, having them having no grace provided to him, and having them met with punitive measures. And that was difficult because, you know, as reporters, you're taught to, you know, report the full story of a human being, not to see them in a one-dimensional way. And it often seemed, as Floyd was going through these systems, especially the criminal justice system, that he was seen in this one-dimensional way as a criminal, as someone who needed to be locked away, never provided with rehabilitation, never provided with any kind of training, even while he was locked up, just locked away and told by society, you don't belong, we're not going to care about you, we're going to put you on the margins and go on about our business. That was affecting to know that, you know, in some ways I had been a part of that system, because, you know, I felt I hadn't done enough to acknowledge it and to write about it and to shine a light on it. You know, people are still kind of wasting away an entire generation. You know, we wrote about the mass incarceration and the war on drugs, and how people are still suffering under that for nonviolent drug offenses. And, you know, there's a sense of guilt that you might have, even as a black man, as a, you know, relatively stable, you know, somewhat successful, at least, you know, by modern standards, someone in the professional world. You know, you feel an obligation to shine a light on other people who didn't get the opportunities that you got. So it was affecting in that way, and it's one of the reasons I hope that people read this book, because I think that that's one step, one tiny thing that Robert and I can do to try to shine a light on some of the injustices that are out there.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a story and about the day I felt the most affected. And it was a Sunday during the trial, and I had spent the morning with Toluse Floyd at a church in Minneapolis, where he had a breakdown in front of me. And then after that, Joshua Lott, who was the photographer with me, we were supposed to drive to meet Courtney Ross, who was speaking at a rally for the first time. It was the first time she was ever going to go out in public and talk about George Floyd. And as we get there, we have Courtney calls, and she's heaving. She's outside of her car. She's having this intense panic attack. So this is how the day starts.
Mm-hmm.
The rally begins, and the leader, the person who's running the rally, says, we're going to have some speakers, but everyone keep it short. And I figured to myself, well, she's just trying to make sure things are going, but that's not the reason. The reason is that there are so many mothers and loved ones who had lost loved ones to police officers in dubious practices. They had no cameras to catch it. There was no social media, and they were living with this kind of pain. And as the rally concludes, someone looks at a text and says, they've just killed another one. And this was a 20-year-old boy named Dante Wright, who was shot and killed by a police officer who mistook her gun for a taser. And at that point, I was completely, you know, I felt like I'm overwhelmed. I can't do any more. But those women didn't miss a step. They got in their cars, and they went to that mother, and they swaddled her. And it reminded me of a few things. The first thing is that it taught me was about the encircling power of racism. That I had always sort of seen it as something that just hung in the air. But it started feeling more like a force. And I started realizing why they continued to march. Because if they didn't confront it, nothing was going to change. Nothing was going to go away. And the second thing that it made me think of is just the incredible persistence that I was seeing amongst the black people that I was around. That despite everything that they had seen, and during the book we talk about all of these times when the Floyd family essentially could have said, this stream is bankrupt, but they never stopped believing in it. And that's one of the messages that I hope people get from the book. But also, I think it recalibrated the ideas that I had about race and racism.
Interesting. There's a story that you tell in the book. It's a small story, but I just had to slam the book down at this point, and because what had happened made me so angry. And it's in Houston, and Floyd is with his friend who later becomes a bail bondsman, I guess, and they're out in the other guy's Cadillac, and they get pulled over by police. And they have some, snacks and some ice cream in the car, and the police, I guess in a search for drugs which were not there or whatever, don't just, conduct a search. They throw the snacks on the ground and the ice cream on the ground, and they go out of their way to humiliate them and to make it clear that they are lesser and suspect and how did I mean, obviously you talked to the gentleman who was involved, but how did that affect you too? That because still get that frisson if you get pulled over by a cop.
Yeah, and one of the things that was really interesting about this scene was that George Floyd is released from custody. They take the handcuffs off. They say, get up. He gets off of his stomach. His friend gets off of his stomach. They get back in the car. His friend is looking around his Cadillac and saying, they tore everything up. They took my radio out of my car. They threw the snacks on the floor. His friend's kind of angry and upset and pissed off, actually, that this happened. He was a bail bondsman at the time, and he knew enough about the Constitution to know that this was unconstitutional. He wasn't a lawyer, but he had known enough about the criminal justice system to know that that wasn't right. Floyd knew it wasn't right as well, but as they were driving home, Floyd looks over and he breathes a sigh of relief and he says, "Thank you, Jesus, we're not going to jail tonight." And he thought about the fact that he didn't have to go to jail. He hadn't been badly beaten, and that was, in his mind, a win based on the experiences that he had had with police officers in his community over the course of several years. And if you think about that perspective, how different it is from the perspective that most of us have when we think about the police in our communities. The police in Floyd's community, they were not seen as a force for protection or a force to be trusted. They were seen as an oppressive force. And this was happening during the war on drugs. This was happening during the time when America's prison system was ballooning and it was being fed by people who look like Floyd. We looked at the statistics and we recite the statistics, and they're galling. And you look at what happened over the course of Floyd's lifetime. And this was not just a social science project. This was real. This is what was happening to Floyd and his brothers and his friends and his classmates and his teammates. No one was not touched by this system. Almost all of Floyd's friends had a criminal record, often for nonviolent petty drug possession. And obviously there are the studies that show that what was happening at the University of Houston, what was happening in much wealthier communities when it comes to drug use, there's not a difference. There's social science that shows that it's happening at the same rate, but there's not that level of police attention and police targeting. And like I said earlier, I felt a little guilty for not shining more of a light on this particular nuisance and this particular machine, because I think it's something that we as a country all feed into if we don't pay enough attention to it. And Floyd was someone who was a victim of it. He did obviously have his own record, and it was something that he agonized over and regretted. And we don't shy away from talking about the times he made mistakes and the times that he fell into this system. But we wanted to take a holistic approach and show how the system funnels so many people that look like him into prisons and leave them with no hope and no training and no restitution or no ability to rehabilitate themselves, and throws them back out into the community and say, and essentially, look out for yourself and, you know, good luck. And so many people in Floyd's life were decimated by this system. His community was decimated by this system. And we wanted to show that it's not just about an individual person, it's about what's happening structurally.
You talked to a number of the witnesses who watched who were there on the scene, who watched as George Floyd died. How, a two-part question, I guess, how did that change them, and if there's a theme there, and also, since we were all witnesses, how do you think it changed us? You know.
Two distinct questions.
Yeah.
I think one of the most compelling interviews that we did was with Genevieve Hansen. Genevieve was the EMT who was on the scene and demanded that the officers check his pulse, and they ignore her. So I'm speaking with Genevieve, and she's walking me through the day. She was on a simple walk. She got an ice cream cone because it was hot that day. She was listening to a podcast, and she comes across this scene. And I started to ask her, well, you know, why do you think they ignored you? And Genevieve, she had grown up in Minneapolis. She had known about some of the disparities that were between blacks and whites within those cities. It's one of the most unequal cities in the United States. And she always sort of papered over it. And she said to me, you know, Robert, I just kept on thinking, if I looked like the other firefighters, would they believe me? Would they have allowed me to do the job that I wanted to do? And so there was an awareness that was awoken within her, even though she might not have agreed with a lot of the protests. She didn't want to see her city burned down. And the conversation that we had about going into the trial and having to convince prosecutors what she could see again and what she could not see again in terms of the video, a very powerful testimony. And one of the takeaways at the end is her thinking about how she was treated and how all the other eyewitnesses were treated, which is a part of looking at some of these systemic issues. What does a state owe a person who goes up and talks about the most terrible time of their life? And although she's super happy that Derek Chauvin got convicted because she witnessed the murder, when you spoke with her or some of the other witnesses, they will tell you what they really wanted, aside from that conviction, was some sense of absolution. A phone call, a trip to a therapist, none of those things happened.
Wow, interesting. And part two of the question.
Part two of the question, what does it mean for us? I mean, I never thought I was really qualified to answer because I felt like I was living a lot of this. You know, when we started the reporting, none of the people I was embedding myself with knew that Derek Chauvin was going to be convicted. Right. No one knew that the Policing Act wouldn't happen. We all lived it together. But toward the end of the process, we had a conversation with Jesse Jackson. And, you know, I asked, you know, what do you make of this? It's only been a month or two. Everyone seems to have moved on. This police reform that seemed like a good deal, that seemed like it was going to happen, is not going to happen. How do you square this? And he started talking to us about looking at the longer arc of history. And so not just assessing what happened in the moment, but to consider where we were 50, 60 years ago, where he was, and how comfortable he felt speaking out against cops when Emmett Till was murdered, and he was the same age as Emmett Till. And he said, you have to remember that no matter what happens, we're still winning because it's still so much better than it was before. Now, the larger question, I think, is how do you continue to make progress, right? As we were writing the books that everyone agreed would be good to read are now the same books that are being banned in 2022, right? These cultural conversations that we're having about flags and symbols and iconography that were settled are now starting to resurrect themselves.
Well,
and so the question that I think we have to wrestle with is, we wrote this book. A part of the reason why the book isn't just incredibly depressing and hard to read is George Floyd himself, his optimism, his belief that something good can happen in this country if we recognize the fullness of people. So I guess the question to ask ourselves in terms of building a better America is, what are you doing, what are we doing to recognize that fullness? And that's the question we hope the book recenters the conversation on.
Well, that's a great way to. We're going to move into the Q&A part of the evening to give you a chance to ask Robert and Toluse some questions, just to observe. I think Reverend Jackson's point is right in that I've always believed this, unfortunately, is the way we make progress on race in this country. And it's never easy, it's never comfortable, it's often tragic, it's very scratchy and full of conflict, like the Civil War, but and the Civil Rights Movement, and we can look back 10 or 15 or 20 years later and say we're in a better place than we were then. So I hope that 15 or 20 or 25 years later, if I'm still around, I hope we look back and say that that we did ultimately learn something, and that Floyd's death, needless death, cruel death, did change the world. So we will see. Questions?
Yes, thank you. So I'm trying to gather my thoughts, so I'm sorry in advance if this question is a little convoluted. First, thank you guys for writing this book. I didn't know about it before this event, but I think some of the things you kind of ended on just now about telling the full story of somebody's life is something that I've sort of been grappling with myself. Is, this story, the symbol of like the murder of George Floyd, is very galvanizing in a political sense, but then it kind of flattens a man's life into, just those 10 minutes, like you said. And I think, politically, these kind of symbols are powerful, both for positive and negative reasons. I think about like caricatures like, welfare queens and others, and how you can use, when you tell simple stories about people, it can really, it can be a powerful political tool. And, I feel like there's, one of the things I struggle with what you guys have brought up is there's a certain inevitability to these killings, because like I think about Philando Castile and how many times he was stopped before that one stop that kills him, right? And so it's like, if you're going to stop somebody 50 times, that's the story more than the one time that he was killed, right? But I think that these stories get lost sometimes in the noise, and it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's powerful and galvanizing, but it is sort of a distraction, I think, from the broader context of what's happening. So I guess my question is to you guys as journalists, as storytellers, what would your advice be to people who are covering these stories, and how they can focus on both elements of these stories, right? The injustice of that moment, but also the broader context that they live within. And since you guys have both written about it as journalists, but also now in a book form and fleshing all of that out, I just am curious kind of how you grapple with that.
That's such a great question, and it's an existential issue that we as journalists and reporters and the broader public we face in trying to figure out what to pay attention to, what to focus on. The news cycle moves so quickly these days, and there's so much that can seize upon our attention. And Floyd's death obviously held the country and the world's attention for an amount of time, and then at some point the world and the country kind of moved on. But the issues that he faced during his life, maybe not as newsworthy. We've kind of created a system where it's easy to ignore, it's easy to drive over certain communities on the freeway and not think about what's happening in those communities. It's easy to not have our kids go to certain schools and not worry about what's happening in those schools that are left behind. It's easy to have prisons that are, built in rural communities far away from us and not care about what's happening in them. So I think as journalists, it's important for us to look beyond the headline, beyond the moment, and cover some of these issues on a structural basis and constantly be telling the stories. These stories are hiding in plain sight. There are people that are living with these issues on a daily basis, and it's hard. Where there's a big push for more diversity in journalism. That's a part of it. Part of it is finding those stories as they exist, and they are compelling stories. George Floyd's story was compelling before he met Derek Chauvin. There was a story to be told about the millions of George Floyds that are alive and struggling and striving and trying to make it in America. And I think it's important and incumbent upon us as journalists and on us as a broader public to not look past those stories, not ignore those stories, not allow the fast-moving news cycle or the fact that there's so much that competes for our attention to take us away from the everyday trauma and the everyday struggles that people are facing. It's so easy to craft a community and to craft a structure that allows those things to be ignored. But it's important for us, even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, to keep telling those stories, keep shining a light on those issues, and make sure that they don't get left behind.
Thanks for being here today. A bit of a softball question, I hope. Wanted to ask what you plan on writing on next. Specifically, do you plan to continue to write on different aspects of systemic racism in the United States? There could have been a point where, with this work, you were digging in on an issue and you realized and you looked at each other and said, this is a whole other book, and maybe you plan to tackle that. The answer might be, I don't know. It might be, it depends on what the Post has us reporting on. It could go in a lot of ways, but I'm curious as to what you're planning on doing next.
I think you gave both answers. I don't know, and it depends on... No, but I think on a larger level, right? The race story in the United States is not an isolated story, right? It should be a part of our considerations with everything that we do. And I think, Tolune and I, we function within a system. We function in the system of journalism at the Washington Post. And I think it's important for both of us to be able to speak up and note these things when we don't think they're being noticed.
That's my answer as well. This has been a consuming process. It's been fascinating first book. It's been difficult, but there is something that it's unlocked in me and in Robert, I'm sure as well, in terms of the power of being able to tell a story over time, and it's all of its nuance and context. There's a beauty in journalism and being able to write stories for the newspaper and be a part of history in that first draft of history. There's something powerful as well about having that second draft of history where you can take a little bit more time, give people a little bit more space, be able to write anecdotes in a narrative way that maybe is a little more compelling than a 25-inch story. And there is that, as hard as it was and as difficult as it was to do this, there is an interest in seeing how we can continue to do that and grow as writers and continue to experience the power of storytelling in longer form stories. Still figuring out how that will happen, what it will be about, but there is a power that I think we felt in doing this that we didn't know that we would feel. And that we're interested in figuring out how to keep it going.
What about the young woman, teenager, who took the video? Did you interview her?
We did not. We tried very hard. She's in a really tough place. This is public, so I can say this, but we had agreed to an interview, and days later She lost an uncle who was run over by a police officer. And then the next time we had set the appointment, she had a bout of coronavirus. So we did not get the opportunity.
Hi, I wanted to
Hi,
know.
Mom.
Lost you. I wanted to know, have you been in touch with the Floyd family, and how are they doing?
Yeah, it's a very large family, and one of the things we write about in the book is that we had Sunday dinner with the family as a part of this writing process, and there are different members of the family that are dealing with the aftermath of Floyd's death differently. It was harder on some than others, but we spent a lot of time with his family members in order to write this book, his siblings, his aunts, his uncles, his loved ones, his friends, and some are feeling that Floyd's death created in them a sense of activism that made them want to speak out against the injustices that he faced in life and speak out against police brutality, and some have been much more public as public figures and activists. Some have grieved more privately, and we were honored that they were willing to speak to us even about their private grief, because it's hard. They think about the movement that sprouted up after their loved one died, and they think about all these millions of people that took to the streets, and it's gratifying and it's emotional, but then they think about the fact that they've lost this person, they've lost their loved one. People take to the streets and they put him on murals, and one of his aunts told us he's everywhere. He's on murals, he's on commercials, he's on television, but he's not here. He's not in my apartment, he's not with me. So there's a level of grief that is enduring, and I think in part because they had to grieve publicly. They were thrust into this international movement before they even had a chance to breathe and to grieve, and that's part of the reason why it's been so difficult. But we have spent a lot of time with Floyd's family members. Robert spent a lot of time with them in Minneapolis, going to the Mall of America and going to church and going to restaurants and seeing how they were trying to cope with both the trial and the aftermath of Floyd's death. And just being able to spend time with them has given us a sense for the power of the family. And in the little time that I have left, I do want to give a plug to part of the book that goes into Floyd's family history. We trace Floyd's ancestry back more than 200 years, and one of the things we saw was that Floyd's great-great-grandfather was born enslaved, but he was able to get his freedom after the Civil War, and he actually became quite wealthy. He worked very hard with a very large family, and he owned 500 acres of land in North Carolina, which in the late 1800s made him one of the wealthiest black men in that part of North Carolina. And we document the family lore that was told to us by substantiating it with records, how he lost all of his land before he could transfer it to his descendants. It was seized by unscrupulous businessmen. It was seized by tax authorities that basically fraudulently told him that he owed this money, and as a result of him owing this small amount of money, they're going to take the entire land, which was worth much more than what he allegedly owned. And this was at a time of intense racial terror in America after Reconstruction, and he lost everything. And it's easy to envision that proud family history being the proud family history of an industrious heirs of people who worked hard and were able to get a lot of wealth from their hard work, but instead his descendants became sharecroppers. Floyd's grandparents and parents were sharecroppers. They weren't able to earn anything to give to their descendants, even though they worked hard, and Floyd came into the world poor. So they have a proud family history. Their history is as long as America's history, and it involves a lot of hard work over the course of centuries. But despite all of that hard work, Floyd came into the world poor, and that's something that leaves a sting for a family, especially to lose a loved one the way that they did as an agent of the state. I really encourage people to pick up the book. I don't want to give away too much about that story, especially the ending of that chapter. But I think it's something that we all have to think about, because people say that racism and slavery and Jim Crow was so long ago, but we are able to see the repercussions in the life of somebody in the 21st century who lived and experienced the results of not being able to inherit the wealth that his ancestors created.
Yeah, it's like Faulkner said, the past isn't even past, and that sort of racism isn't even past. So it's continued time and again. That's the same story in my family of, success after the Civil War, taken away. Success taken away. That's what has happened.
Thank you, both of you, for this amazing book. In my view, it actually will change America and possibly even the world, precisely because it actually shows or illustrates the entire system of oppression that has been existing and that has transformed over time, but that still keeps being present in different forms. And I think you mentioned one, or you focused on one element of policing, but there is a whole economic, monster or system that basically is keeping people like George Floyd down. But he is not an outlier, and in my opinion, his death is just a tiny fraction of the deaths of so many African Americans that you've described, because more than him, they die way before that because of heart attacks or because of other hardships that this oppressive system is imposing on them. But my question is, there is another side of that oppressive system, and that is the enforcers, the police officers, the judges. There is a whole industry or system, the prisons, that employs people, a lot of white people, but also Latin Americans and African Americans. I'd be very curious to hear what is their perspective on the daily injustice that they are doing. I imagine there must be people that are struggling with themselves, and possibly even someone like Derek Chauvin, because from what I've read is he doesn't seem to be a notorious or ideological racist. He seems to be someone that has been basically just grew up or groomed in a militarized system where policing and law enforcement is idealized, and he is a product of that. I don't want to say that, it's just a question, actually. Did you speak to other, law enforcement, and did you get sometimes maybe a sense of regret or something,
Yeah.
Thank you.
In one of the chapters of the book, we look at the history of the Minneapolis Police Department, and we're trying to figure out what made Derek Chauvin, because as much as we talk about systemic racism shaping the lives of black people, it also shapes the lives of white people. And some of the things we learned as we spoke to former police chiefs, one of the most interesting things that came up was that the type of hold that Derek Chauvin used on George Floyd was supposed to be something good because it prevented the use of fatal force. That's why they started teaching people how to use the prone restraint. So what happens? Well, you're in a police department that encourages you to use aggressive force. There are people who talk to us about the legacy of why that was and why that might not have changed even when crime changed. And a force that is not being disciplined. So essentially you had people within the community who are complaining about not just Derek Chauvin, but other officers. Everyone we talked to said the number of complaints Derek Chauvin had were pretty average. But if you're in a system when you're an enforcer of the law, when no one's watching what you're doing, you can take advantage of it. And we documented 9 instances of Derek Chauvin using that neck restraint. A number of them employed because he said the guy was much bigger than him. Derek Chauvin is only 5'9". And none of those neck restraints got any public investigation. There was no documentation of it. There were children who he held in that hold for longer than he held George Floyd in that hold. They survived because they were younger. And no one said anything. And so the question, or what we can conclude is that if you're not watching enforcement and you're not monitoring people in a community in which they're told to be aggressive, the worst can happen. The 9th person was George Floyd, and he killed him.
I think our time is up. We need to get the authors to their next gig. So let's thank Robert and Toluse. Thank you for writing the book, and